No good deed goes unpunished. That's what the cynics say, right? When Jessica stepped out of the hospital into a freezing November downpour, she wasn't thinking about consequences, survival, or the criminal underworld. She was just looking at a 6-year-old boy, shivering in a pitch-black alleyway, completely alone. She thought she was simply saving a lost child from the storm. She didn't know she was picking up the sole heir to the Rossi crime syndicate. She didn't know that taking his little, freezing hand would drag her into a violent, blood-soaked war, or that his father, the most ruthless, feared man on the East Coast, was already tearing the city apart to find them. The rain in Chicago that night wasn't just falling. It felt like it was trying to punish the city. Jessica Bennett pulled her trench coat tighter against her scrubs, her bones aching from a grueling 14-hour shift in the ER at Memorial Hospital. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the flooded pavement. She just wanted to get to her cramped, third-floor walk-up, make a cup of cheap tea, and sleep for a week. But as she hurried past the narrow, trash-strewn alley behind O'Leary's pub, a flash of movement caught her eye. Jessica stopped, her combat boots sinking into a deep puddle. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the rain. A small figure stepped out from behind an overflowing dumpster. It was a little boy, no older than 6. He was drenched to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. But what made Jessica's breath hitch wasn't just that he was alone at 2 a.m. It was the juxtaposition of his appearance. He was wearing a soaked, bespoke cashmere coat that probably cost more than Jessica's annual rent, but his small hands were stained with something dark and metallic smelling. Blood. Jessica immediately dropped her bag and rushed to him, her nurse's instincts overriding any sense of urban caution. "Hey, sweetie. Are you hurt? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't speak. He just stared up at her with wide, hollow, dark eyes that had seen something a child should never see. He was trembling violently, his lips tinted a dangerous shade of blue. "Okay. It's okay." "You're freezing," Jessica murmured, quickly stripping off her own dry scarf and wrapping it around his neck. She checked his hands. The blood wasn't his. There were no cuts. "I live just 2 blocks away. We're going to get you out of this rain, warm you up, and call the police. Not, if you understand." The boy didn't nod, but when Jessica held out her hand, his tiny, freezing fingers clamped onto hers with a desperate iron grip. Jessica hurried him through the storm, glancing over her shoulder. The streets were dead, yet the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the shadows in the alley were watching them. Once inside her apartment, Jessica locked the deadbolt. She quickly ran a warm bath, wrapping the silent boy in her oversized, fluffy robe. She made him a mug of hot chocolate, setting it on the chipped laminate counter. He clutched the mug, the trembling slowly subsiding, but his eyes never left her face. He was studying her, cataloguing her every move. "I'm Jessica," she said softly, pulling out her cell phone. "I'm going to call the police now so they can find your mum and dad. What's your name?" The boy set the mug down. With a small, trembling finger, he traced a single letter into the condensation on the side of the ceramic cup. "L." "L," Jessica smiled gently. "Okay, L. Let's get you home." She dialed 911. But the moment the dispatcher picked up, the lights in Jessica's apartment violently flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. Total silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of tires screeching to a halt on the wet pavement outside. Jessica walked to the window and peered through the blinds. Her heart stopped. 5 blacked-out SUVs had just blockaded her street. There were no sirens, No flashing police lights, just a dozen men in dark, tailored suits stepping out into the pouring rain, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They didn't look up at the building. They simply flooded through the front doors of Jessica's apartment complex. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice buzzed tinny from the phone in Jessica's hand. Before Jessica could speak, heavy, thundering footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. The boy, L, didn't panic. He simply slid off the bar stool, walked over to Jessica, and stood behind her legs, clutching the fabric of her scrubs. Crack! Jessica's reinforced front door exploded off its hinges, sending splinters of wood flying across her living room. Jessica screamed, dropping her phone as 3 men poured into the room, assault rifles raised and sweeping the corners. They were professionals, cold, efficient, deadly. "Clear!" one shouted. "Kitchen is clear!" Then the men parted, lowering their weapons. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as a man stepped through the ruined doorway. He was towering, broad-shouldered, and soaked from the rain. He wore a dark wool overcoat over a ruined tuxedo, his tie undone. His face looked like it was carved from granite, strikingly handsome, but carrying a terrifying, lethal stillness. A nasty, fresh cut bled sluggishly over his left eyebrow, but he didn't seem to notice. This was Gabriel Rossi. Even Jessica, who actively avoided the local news, recognized the ghost of Chicago's underworld. Gabriel's dark, predatory eyes scanned the room, instantly calculating the threat level. He saw the cheap furniture, the medical textbooks on the coffee table, and finally, the terrified woman in scrubs standing defensively in front of a small boy in an oversized pink robe. Gabriel's chest heaved. A fraction of the lethal tension bled out of his posture. "Leo," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Jessica's chest. The boy peeked out from behind Jessica's legs. He didn't run to his father. He just stared. Gabriel's eyes locked onto Jessica. She felt like prey caught in the crosshairs of a sniper rifle. "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping forward. Stay back," Jessica stammered, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. It was a pathetic defense against heavily armed men, but it was all she had. "I don't know who you are, but I've already called the police." One of the armed men chuckled dryly. Gabriel just tilted his head, his eyes flicking to the skillet, then back to her face. "The police on this payroll report to me, sweetheart," Gabriel said coldly. He stepped closer, ignoring her weapon completely. He looked down at his son. "Are you hurt, Leo?" Leo shook his head silently. Gabriel looked at the empty bathtub in the hall, the warm towels, the hot chocolate on the counter. He processed the scene in seconds. She wasn't a kidnapper. She was a bystander who had stumbled into a war zone. "The hitmen at the restaurant," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, addressing his men but looking at Jessica. "They chased him 3 blocks. She found him before they did." Gabriel reached into his coat and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, tossing it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy thud next to the hot chocolate. "For the door," Gabriel said. He crouched down to his son's level. "Come, Leo, we're leaving." Leo looked up at Jessica. For a fleeting second, his grip tightened on her scrubs. Then he let go, walking silently over to his father. Gabriel scooped the boy up into his arms, burying the child's face in his neck. Gabriel paused at the ruined doorway, turning back to look at Jessica one last time. "You didn't see anything tonight," Gabriel said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. "If you try to find us, or if you speak to a uniform about this, I will know." Before Jessica could take a breath, they were gone. The only proof they had ever been there was the shattered door the scent of expensive cologne and rainwater, and $20,000 in cash sitting on her kitchen counter. 4 days passed. Jessica tried to convince herself it was a fever dream. She used a fraction of the cash to replace her door, hiding the rest under a loose floorboard. She went to work, she drank her cheap tea, and she kept her head down. She checked the news obsessively, but there was no mention of a shootout at a restaurant, no mention of the Rossi family. It was as if a ghost had passed through her life and vanished. But the underworld leaves a residue. It started with small things. Jessica's creepy landlord, who normally harassed her for rent, suddenly started avoiding eye contact and fixed her heater unprompted. Then, at the hospital, her brutal shift supervisor abruptly transferred her to the premium private care ward, doubling her salary without a single interview. Jessica wasn't stupid. She felt the invisible, suffocating net tightening around her. She was being watched. On a Thursday evening, it all snapped into focus. Jessica was walking to her car in the hospital's underground parking garage. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. As she fished for her keys, she noticed a sleek black town car idling near her rusted sedan. A man in a suit stepped out. Not just any man, the man who had laughed at her cast-iron skillet 4 nights ago. "Miss Bennet," he said politely. "My boss would like a word." Jessica's heart hammered in her throat. "I have nothing to say to him. I kept my mouth shut. I haven't told anyone." The back door of the town car swung open. Gabriel Rossi sat in the shadows of the back seat, the amber glow of the parking garage lights catching the sharp angles of his jaw. The cut on his eyebrow was healing, but the darkness in his eyes was worse than before. "Get in, Miss Bennet," Gabriel said. "No." Jessica backed up. "I saved your son. I didn't ask for this. Leave me alone." Gabriel sighed, rubbing his temples as if he carried the weight of the world. "I am not here to hurt you. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it to your car. Get in. We need to talk about Leo." The mention of the boy made Jessica hesitate. Against every survival instinct she possessed, she walked over and slid into the leather seat opposite the Mafia boss. The doors locked instantly. "What do you want?" Jessica demanded, her voice shaking slightly. "Leo hasn't spoken a single word in 4 days," Gabriel said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding edge, replaced by a raw, exhausted frustration. "He hasn't eaten. He hasn't slept for more than an hour at a time. The best pediatric psychiatrists in the state have looked at him." "Nothing." Jessica frowned, the nurse in her taking over the frightened civilian. "He was deeply traumatized. He needs time and a feeling of safety." "He doesn't feel safe in my house," Gabriel said bitterly. He leaned forward, trapping Jessica in his intense gaze. "But he drew a picture yesterday. My men had to scour the city to figure out what it meant." Gabriel pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to her. Jessica took it. It was a crayon drawing. It showed a tall building, a dark sky, and a woman with messy brown hair wearing a green shirt, the exact color of Jessica's hospital scrubs. The woman was holding a shield over a little boy, protecting him from a shower of black bullets. "He wants you," Gabriel stated flatly. "Me. I spent 20 minutes with him." "You were the only person who didn't look at him like he was a target or a liability," Gabriel said, his voice hardening. "You treated him like a child. Now, here is the situation, Jessica. I am in the middle of a war. The men who attacked us are trying to wipe out my bloodline. I need to handle it, but I cannot do that while my son is starving himself to death. Take him to a private clinic. Have him stay. He stays with me," Gabriel interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "But I am hiring you. You are going to move into my estate. You will be his private caregiver until he speaks again. You will keep him eating, and you will keep him calm. I have a life! I have a job! Jessica protested. Your hospital supervisor has already granted you an indefinite paid leave of absence, Gabriel countered smoothly. Your rent is paid for the next year. Your car is being towed to a secure lockup. You will be paid $10,000 a week, tax-free. And when this is over, you walk away. Jessica stared at him, horrified at how easily he had disassembled and bought her entire existence in a matter of hours. And if I say no? Gabriel leaned back into the shadows, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, inescapable truth. In my world, Jessica, nobody says no to me, especially not when it comes to my son's life. The drive to Lake Forest took less than an hour, but to Jessica, it felt like a descent into another dimension. The Rossi estate wasn't just a house, it was a fortress, masked in old-world architectural brilliance. High wrought-iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling stone mansion surrounded by acres of dense, manicured forest. Security cameras tracked the black SUV's every movement, and men in tailored dark suits with discreet earpieces patrolled the perimeter with imposing German shepherds. Jessica stepped out of the car, clutching her modest duffel bag. The crisp air off Lake Michigan bit at her cheeks. "I'll take that, Miss Bennett," a gruff voice offered. Jessica turned to see a man with salt and pepper hair, a thick build, and a jagged scar cutting across his jawline. He extended a massive, calloused hand. "I'm Silas, head of security. Mr. Rossi is currently handling a dispute. He instructed me to show you to Leo's wing." "Thank you, Silas," Jessica said, her voice tight. She followed him up the sprawling marble steps and through the heavy mahogany double doors. The interior was breathtakingly cold, vaulted ceilings, priceless Renaissance art, and pristine white marble floors that echoed with every step. It felt more like a museum than a home. It lacked warmth, laughter, and the chaotic messiness of a normal childhood. Silas led her up a sweeping grand staircase and down a long corridor guarded by 2 armed men. He opened a door at the end of the hall. The playroom was the size of Jessica's entire apartment, filled with the most expensive educational toys, imported plush animals, and a massive train set. But none of it was being used. In the center of the room, sitting cross-legged on a Persian rug, was Leo. He looked smaller than he had in the alley. He was dressed in pristine dark slacks and a pressed white shirt, looking like a miniature adult. He was staring blankly at a blank sheet of paper, a single black crayon resting in his hand. A tray of untouched gourmet food sat on a nearby table. Jessica's heart broke. The nurse in her instantly categorized his posture: defensive, withdrawn, deeply traumatized. "Leo," she said softly, stepping into the room. The boy flinched, his head snapping up. When his dark eyes locked onto Jessica, the crayon slipped from his fingers. He didn't smile, but a profound shift happened in his chest. His shoulders dropped. He scrambled to his feet and ran to her, crashing into her legs and wrapping his arms tightly around her knees. Jessica dropped to the floor, pulling him into a fierce hug. "Hey, sweetie, I told you I wouldn't leave you in the rain, didn't I?" Leo buried his face in her neck, his tiny hands gripping her sweater. He still didn't speak, but Jessica felt the dampness of tears against her skin. "Okay," Jessica whispered, rubbing his back. "I'm here. We're going to figure this out." For the next 3 hours, Jessica ignored the expensive toys. She took the untouched sandwich from the tray, cut it into ridiculous uneven star shapes, and sat on the floor with him. She talked to him about mundane things: her annoying landlord, a funny dog she saw on the street, the terrible coffee at the hospital. Slowly, Leo took a piece of the star-shaped sandwich. He ate it. Then another. When Gabriel Rossi finally returned to the estate just after midnight, the house was dead silent. He moved with a heavy, exhausted grace, shedding his blood-speckled suit jacket and handing his sidearm to Silas. "How is he?" Gabriel asked, his voice rough. "See for yourself, boss," Silas murmured, nodding toward the ajar door of Leo's bedroom. Gabriel walked quietly down the hall and pushed the door open. The sight froze him in his tracks. Leo was fast asleep in his massive four-poster bed, his breathing even and deep. But he wasn't alone. Jessica had fallen asleep in the oversized armchair next to the bed, a children's book resting on her chest, her hand still loosely holding on to Leo's. For the first time since the attack, Gabriel felt the crushing, suffocating vice around his ribs loosen. He stared at the woman in the cheap sweater who had just infiltrated his impenetrable fortress and achieved the impossible in a single afternoon. 3 weeks blurred into a strange, rhythmic routine. To the outside world, Gabriel Rossi was a phantom, a ruthless tactician tearing apart the rival Moretti syndicate block by block. The Morettis had broken the ultimate code by targeting Gabriel's bloodline, and Gabriel's retaliation was biblical. But inside the estate, Jessica saw a completely different man. She saw Gabriel sitting on the playroom floor in his 3-piece suits, awkwardly trying to build a Lego castle because Leo pointed to it. She saw him carefully slicing apples for his son's breakfast. She saw the heavy, lingering sadness in his eyes whenever he looked at the boy. Leo was improving. He hadn't spoken yet, but the color had returned to his cheeks. He communicated with Jessica through drawings and gestures. He followed her around the estate like a shadow, clinging to her warmth. One stormy Tuesday night, the violent reality of Gabriel's world breached the quiet sanctuary of the house. Jessica was in the kitchen, brewing her cheap chamomile tea. She refused to drink the estate's imported blends when the back door slammed open. Gabriel stumbled in, leaning heavily against the granite island. He was alone. His white dress shirt was soaked in crimson, and a deep, jagged laceration tore across his left bicep, bleeding profusely. He looked feral, his eyes wild and dilated from adrenaline and pain. Jessica dropped her mug. It shattered on the floor. "Silas!" Jessica screamed, rushing forward. "No!" Gabriel barked, grabbing her wrist with a bloodied hand. He winced, his breathing ragged. "No doctors. No crew. The Morettis. They hit a warehouse. It was an ambush. I can't let my men see me bleeding like this. It shows weakness. You're going to bleed to death on your imported Italian marble, you idiot!" Jessica snapped, her medical training overriding her fear of the Mafia boss. "Sit down. Now." Gabriel blinked, surprised by her tone. Nobody spoke to him like that. But he obeyed, sinking heavily onto a bar stool. Jessica sprinted to the downstairs bathroom, returning with a fully stocked trauma kit she had demanded Silas procure weeks ago. She didn't hesitate. She took a pair of trauma shears and cut away the ruined sleeve of Gabriel's custom shirt. The cut was deep, slicing through muscle, but it had missed the brachial artery. "This is going to hurt," Jessica said, soaking a gauze pad in antiseptic. "I've had worse," Gabriel grunted. As Jessica worked, her face inches from his arm, the kitchen fell into a heavy, charged silence. The only sound was the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gabriel watched her. He watched the intense concentration on her face, the gentle but firm way her hands moved over his skin. "Why did they target Leo?" Jessica asked quietly as she began to stitch the wound, the needle slipping through his skin with practiced precision. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Carmine Moretti. He runs the West Side. 5 years ago, I took something from him. Territory. He swore he would take my heart in return." Gabriel looked away, staring into the dark, rain-streaked window. He tried once before, 4 years ago, A car bomb. It was meant for me." Jessica paused, her hands hovering over his arm. "Who?" "My wife." "Sophia," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. Leo was in the back seat, securely strapped into a reinforced car seat. He survived with just a concussion. Sophia took the brunt of the blast. Jessica felt a cold chill run down her spine. That's why Leo didn't speak in the alley. The trauma. It wasn't his first time. "He remembers the fire," Gabriel said, looking back at Jessica. The ruthless Mafia boss was gone. In his place was just a broken, terrified father. "I promised Sophia on her grave I would protect him. I failed." "You didn't fail," Jessica said fiercely, tying off the last suture and taping down a bandage. She looked up, meeting his dark, intense gaze. "He is alive. You are keeping him alive. You're a good father, Gabriel." Gabriel reached out, his uninjured hand brushing a stray lock of hair behind Jessica's ear. The touch was startlingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he had just endured. His fingers lingered against her jawline, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You are a very dangerous woman, Jessica Bennett," Gabriel murmured, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips. "Me? I'm just a nurse," she breathed, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "You made me care about something other than revenge," he said softly. "In my world, that is the most dangerous thing of all." The shift in their dynamic was undeniable, but they had no time to explore it. The war with the Morettis was reaching a boiling point. Silas doubled the guard detail. Jessica and Leo were confined to the upper floors of the estate. But a fortress is only as strong as the men guarding the gates. It was a quiet Friday afternoon. Gabriel was in his study, interrogating a captured Moretti lieutenant. Jessica was in the library with Leo, helping him piece together a massive jigsaw puzzle of the solar system. One of the newer guards, a man named Wyatt, stepped into the room. He was pale, sweating slightly, and his hand rested far too heavily on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Miss Bennett," Wyatt said, his voice strained. "Mr. Rossi needs you and the boy in the secure bunker downstairs. Now." Jessica frowned. Silas was the one who usually delivered security protocols, and the alarm hadn't sounded. "Silas didn't page me," Jessica said, slowly standing up and subtly pushing Leo behind her legs. "Silas is busy," Wyatt snapped, taking a step forward. "We have a perimeter breach. Move!" Jessica's instincts, honed from years in chaotic emergency rooms, flared to life. Wyatt's pupils were dilated. He was lying. "Okay," Jessica said, keeping her voice incredibly calm. "Let me just grab Leo's inhaler from his bedroom first." "No time," Wyatt said, pulling his gun and aiming it directly at Jessica's chest. The facade dropped. "Carmine wants the boy. Put your hands up and walk toward me, or I blow a hole through you right here." Leo let out a sharp, terrified gasp, clutching Jessica's pants. Jessica didn't panic. She calculated. She was standing next to a heavy oak reading table. On it was a heavy, antique brass globe. "Don't hurt him," Jessica pleaded, raising her hand slowly, stepping away from Leo to draw Wyatt's aim. "Please, Wyatt. Gabriel will kill you." "Carmine's paying me enough to disappear forever," Wyatt sneered, stepping closer. As Wyatt closed the distance, his eyes flicked toward Leo for a fraction of a second. That was all Jessica needed. With a desperate, primal scream, Jessica grabbed the heavy brass globe and hurled it with all her strength directly at Wyatt's face. Crack! The heavy metal struck Wyatt square in the nose. He shouted in pain, his finger jerking on the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening bang, the bullet shattering a stained glass window inches from Jessica's head. Jessica didn't stop. She lunged forward, tackling the disoriented guard to the ground. She fought like a wild animal, punching, clawing, fighting to keep the gun pointed away from Leo. Wyatt cursed, throwing a brutal punch that caught Jessica in the ribs, knocking the wind out of her. He shoved her off, raising the gun again. Suddenly, the library doors flew open. Gabriel stood in the doorway, a suppressed pistol in his hand. His eyes took in the scene. Jessica gasping on the floor, Wyatt aiming the gun, Leo cowering in the corner. Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. Pfft. Pfft. 2 muffled shots. Wyatt dropped the gun, collapsing to the floor, dead before he hit the Persian rug. Silence slammed back into the room, thick with the smell of gunpowder and copper. Gabriel dropped his weapon and crossed the room in 3 massive strides, falling to his knees beside Jessica. He pulled her into his arms, his hands frantically checking her for bullet wounds. "Jessica! Jessica, look at me! Are you hit?" Gabriel demanded, his voice shaking with a terror Jessica had never heard before. "No," Jessica gasped, clutching her bruised ribs. "I'm okay. Leo. Check Leo." Gabriel looked over. Leo was standing up. The little boy wasn't looking at the dead man. He was looking at Jessica, tears streaming down his face. Leo ran across the room and threw himself into Jessica's arms. "Jessica!" Leo sobbed, his voice rusty and small, breaking the silence of months. "Jessica, don't die." Gabriel froze. He stared at his son, hearing the voice he thought he had lost forever. He looked at Jessica, the woman who had just risked her life to save his boy, fighting off a trained killer with her bare hands. In that moment, the lines between employer, captive, and caregiver shattered completely. Gabriel realized he wasn't just fighting a war for his son anymore. He was fighting a war for his family, and Jessica was part of it. "We're leaving," Gabriel said, his voice cold as ice, his eyes burning with lethal intent. He stood up, pulling Jessica with him. "Pack a bag, Silas!" Silas ran into the room, taking in the dead body. "Burn the house down," Gabriel ordered, his arm tightly wrapped around Jessica's waist. Carmine Moretti just signed his own death warrant. We end this tonight. The Rossi estate burned against the midnight sky, an inferno of wood, stone, and secrets. Jessica watched the flames from the tinted window of the armored SUV as they sped away. Leo tucked safely against her side, his small hands gripping her sweater. The smell of smoke and gunpowder still clung to her hair. Gabriel sat in the passenger seat, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. He was on a satellite phone, barking orders in rapid, sharp Italian. The tactical retreat was flawless. Within an hour, they arrived at a location Jessica never would have expected. An unassuming, run-down industrial bakery in the West Loop of Chicago. Silas led them through the back loading dock, past massive industrial ovens, and into a freight elevator that required a retinal scan to operate. The elevator didn't go up. It went deep underground. When the heavy metal doors parted, Jessica stepped into a subterranean penthouse. It was a stark contrast to the bakery above, sleek, modern, and heavily fortified. Monitors lined one wall, displaying feeds from hundreds of cameras across the city. Racks of tactical gear and weapons sat behind reinforced glass. "This is the bunker," Gabriel said, tossing his ruined jacket onto a leather sofa. "Nobody knows it exists except Silas and 3 of my capos, not even the Morettis." Leo tugged on Jessica's sleeve, pointing to his throat. "Water?" Jessica asked gently. Leo nodded. It was a small movement, but after months of absolute silence, it felt like a miracle. "Kitchen is down the hall to the left," Silas grunted, his eyes scanning the security monitors. "I'll take him, Miss Bennett. Let you catch your breath." As Silas led the boy away, the heavy silence of the bunker fell over Jessica and Gabriel. The adrenaline that had kept Jessica moving was suddenly evaporating, replaced by a deep, agonizing throb in her ribs where Wyatt had struck her. She hissed, wrapping an arm around her torso and leaning against a steel pillar. Gabriel was across the room in a flash. "You're hurt." "Just bruised." Jessica winced, though breathing deeply sent sharp spikes of pain through her chest. He had a good right hook. "Sit," Gabriel commanded, his voice brokering no argument. He guided her to a chair beneath the harsh, bright lights of the tactical map table. He retrieved a medical kit from the wall and knelt in front of her. "Lift your shirt." Jessica hesitated, her cheeks flushing, but the severe, clinical look in Gabriel's eyes told her this wasn't the time for modesty. She pulled the hem of her sweater and the t-shirt underneath up to her sternum. An ugly, mottled purple bruise was already blooming across her left ribcage. Gabriel's breath hitched. His massive, calloused hands that had ended lives, reached out, his fingertips brushing against her skin with agonizing, reverent gentleness. "He touched you," Gabriel whispered, a lethal darkness swirling in his dark eyes. "I killed him too quickly." "Gabriel," Jessica said softly, putting her hand over his to stop his trembling. "I'm alive. Leo is alive. That's all that matters." Gabriel looked up, his gaze locking with hers. The mask of the feared Mafia boss crumbled completely, leaving only a man who had nearly lost everything he held dear for a second time. "You threw a brass globe at a man with a loaded gun," Gabriel said, his voice raw. "Do you have any idea how reckless that was? You could have died, Jessica. You could have left me." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I couldn't let him take Leo," Jessica replied fiercely. "I wouldn't." "Why?" Gabriel asked, standing up and pulling her to her feet, though he kept his hands on her waist, drawing her impossibly close. "You were a stranger. I pulled you into a nightmare. You owe us nothing." "Because I love him," Jessica admitted, the truth spilling out of her before she could stop it. And because I—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Gabriel's hand slid to the back of her neck, tangling in her hair, and he crashed his lips down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and fueled by the terror of the night. Jessica gasped, but she didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had gone completely mad. For a moment, there was no war, no Moretti syndicate, no danger. There was only the heat of him, the scent of rain and smoke, and the undeniable realization that she was irrevocably tied to the devil of Chicago. The tender moment was violently interrupted by the blaring alarm of the bunker's communication console. Gabriel tore himself away, his chest heaving, his eyes instantly returning to the cold, calculating stare of a general at war. He strode to the console, hitting a flashing red button. "Speak!" Gabriel barked. Static hissed over the speaker before a smooth, chillingly calm voice filled the room. "Gabriel, I see you decided to redecorate your estate with gasoline, a bold choice." It was Carmine Moretti. Gabriel's jaw locked. "Carmine, you sent a dog to do a wolf's job. Wyatt is dead." "A minor setback," Carmine chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "But I didn't call to gloat over a dead pawn. I called to offer a trade. You see, while you were busy burning your house down, my men paid a visit to Memorial Hospital." Jessica's blood ran cold. "Dr. Aris Thorne, head of pediatrics, a lovely man, really," Carmine continued, his voice dripping with malice. "He's currently sitting in a chair in my warehouse on Navy Pier, missing 2 fingernails. He tells me he's been consulting on a very special, very quiet case for a boy who refuses to speak. He also mentioned the lovely nurse who arranged it all. Jessica, I believe." Jessica stumbled backward, covering her mouth with her hand. Dr. Thorne was her mentor, the man who had helped her get the private psychiatric files for Leo without logging them in the official hospital system. "If you touch him," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper, "I will peel the skin from your bones while you watch." "Tough talk, Gabriel," Carmine mocked. "Here are my terms. You want the doctor alive? You want this war to end without the hospital turning into a slaughterhouse? You come to the pier, alone. You hand over the East Side territories, and you surrender the boy. You have 1 hour. Bring the nurse, too. I want to see the woman who ruined my inside man." The line went dead. Gabriel punched the steel console, the metal denting under his fist. "Silas, gear up. Call the strike teams. We're hitting Navy Pier." "Gabriel, no!" Jessica interrupted, stepping in front of him. "It's a trap. If you go in there with guns blazing, Dr. Thorne is dead." "If I don't go in there, he's dead anyway," Gabriel roared. "Carmine doesn't leave loose ends, and he knows I won't hand over my son. He's baiting me into a kill box." Jessica's mind raced. Her years in the ER had trained her to remain hyper-focused during a crisis. She looked at the tactical map on the monitors. Navy Pier. A tourist trap by day, a desolate concrete wasteland by night. "Carmine said he wants to see the woman who ruined his inside man," Jessica murmured, an insane, suicidal plan forming in her head. She looked at Gabriel. "He wants me. He doesn't know what I look like, only my name." "Absolutely not," Gabriel said instantly, reading her mind. "I am not using you as bait." "You don't have a choice," Jessica snapped, her voice hardening. "He expects you to come with an army. He doesn't expect me to walk through the front door alone." "Jessica, they are butchers, and I am an ER nurse who deals with gunshot wounds and stab victims every Saturday night," Jessica fired back, stepping into his personal space. "Wyatt had a medical condition, Gabriel. I saw his file when I stitched a cut on his hand 2 weeks ago. He had severe, unmanaged asthma. When I threw that globe at him, I didn't just hit his nose. I hit his throat. He dropped the gun because he couldn't breathe." Gabriel stared at her, stunned. "I know human anatomy," Jessica said coldly. "I know how to save a life, and I know exactly where to press to stop one. You are going to wire me. I will walk in, demand to see Dr. Thorne, and buy you the 10 minutes you need to get your snipers into position. You owe me, Gabriel. Let me help you finish this." The rain had turned to sleet by the time Jessica pulled Gabriel's armored Mercedes G-Wagon up to the chain-link gates of Warehouse 47 on Navy Pier. She stepped out into the freezing wind, wearing her oversized trench coat. Beneath it, hidden in the lining, was a ceramic combat knife Silas had given her, undetectable by standard metal wands. Taped to her sternum was a microscopic 2-way transmitter. "I'm at the gate," Jessica whispered into her collar. "I have eyes on you," Gabriel's voice crackled in her earpiece, tight and rigid with anxiety. 3 hostiles on the roof, 4 at the door. Do not engage. Just keep them talking. The second you are clear of the doctor, hit the deck." Jessica walked forward, her hands raised. 2 massive men with assault rifles stepped out of the shadows, shining blinding flashlights in her face. "I'm Jessica Bennett," she shouted over the wind. "Carmine Moretti asked for me." The guards patted her down roughly, their hands missing the ceramic blade hidden in the thick seam of her coat. One of them smirked, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her through the heavy metal doors. The inside of the warehouse smelled of fish, rust, and old blood. In the center of the massive room, bathed in a pool of harsh yellow light, sat Dr. Thorne. He was tied to a chair, his face bruised, blood dripping from his hands. Standing behind him was an older man in a pristine camel hair coat, Carmine Moretti. He leaned on a silver-tipped cane, his face scarred and weathered from decades of brutal violence. Dozens of heavily armed enforcers lined the catwalks above. "Well, well," Carmine chuckled, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "Gabriel Rossi sends a nurse to do his bidding. How the mighty have fallen." "Let the doctor go, Carmine," Jessica said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She took a step closer, calculating the distance. 10 yards. "Gabriel isn't coming. He took the boy and left the city. You lost." Carmine's smile vanished. "Liar. Gabriel wouldn't run. He's a rabid dog. He fights to the death." "He fought for his son," Jessica corrected. "And his son is safe. I'm here to offer you a deal. You let Dr. Thorne walk out of here, and I will tell you the exact location of Gabriel's offshore accounts. The routing numbers, the passwords, everything." It was a bluff, fed to her by Gabriel 20 minutes ago, but it was a good one. Carmine's eyes gleamed with greed. Millions of untraceable dollars were a tempting prize. Carmine gestured with his cane. "Bring her closer. Let's hear these numbers." A guard shoved Jessica forward. She stumbled, falling to her knees, right in front of Carmine and Dr. Thorne. "Jessica, hold position. Snipers are locking on targets on the catwalks," Gabriel's voice whispered in her ear. 3, 2. "The routing number is—" Jessica looked up at Carmine, her eyes flashing with defiance. "Go to hell." In a flash of lightning-fast motion, Jessica whipped her hand into the lining of her coat, drew the ceramic knife, and slashed upward, burying the blade deep into the meaty part of the guard's thigh, standing next to her. The man screamed, dropping his rifle. At that exact millisecond, the high-pitched crack of suppressed sniper fire shattered the glass skylights above. The warehouse erupted into absolute chaos. Men on the catwalks dropped like stones as Silas's tactical team breached the perimeter. Smoke grenades bounced across the concrete floor, filling the room with blinding white fog. "Kill her!" Carmine roared, raising his cane to strike Jessica. But Jessica was already moving. She grabbed Dr. Thorne's chair, throwing her body weight against it to topple him over, shielding him with her own body as bullets rained down, sparking off the concrete. Through the thick smoke, a demon emerged. Gabriel Rossi moved with terrifying, lethal precision. He didn't run. He stalked. Every pull of his trigger found a target. He moved through the crossfire like a ghost, completely untouchable, his eyes locked dead on Carmine. Carmine's remaining guards tried to form a wall, but Gabriel and Silas dismantled them with clinical efficiency. Carmine, realizing the battle was lost, turned to flee toward a back exit. Gabriel dropped his empty rifle. He sprinted, tackling the older boss to the ground. The two men rolled violently over the slick concrete. Carmine pulled a snub-nosed revolver, aiming it at Gabriel's chest. Before Carmine could pull the trigger, Jessica, scrambling on her hands and knees through the smoke, grabbed the dropped assault rifle from the guard she had stabbed. She didn't know how to shoot, but she knew how to swing it. She slammed the heavy wooden stock of the rifle directly into the side of Carmine's head. The old boss slumped backward, unconscious. Gabriel stood up, his chest heaving, his face splattered with blood. He looked down at Carmine, then up at Jessica. She was trembling violently, still holding the rifle like a baseball bat, her trench coat covered in soot. Gabriel stepped over Carmine's body, wrapping his arms around Jessica and burying his face in her hair. "You're insane," Gabriel breathed, his heart hammering against hers. "You are completely, beautifully insane." "I'm a nurse," Jessica gasped, dropping the rifle. "I improvise." The aftermath was handled with the quiet efficiency that only a syndicate of Gabriel's magnitude could manage. Carmine Moretti was handed over to a corrupted FBI contact, Agent Thomas Sterling, who owed Gabriel a massive debt. Carmine would spend the rest of his life in a supermax prison, stripped of his empire, his money, and his pride. Dr. Thorne was secretly transferred to a private clinic in Switzerland, fully funded by the Rossi family, ensuring his silence and his safety. A week later, the war was officially over. The Moretti syndicate was absorbed, and Gabriel's absolute control over the city was cemented. Nobody would ever dare challenge the Rossi bloodline again. But for Jessica, the silence was deafening. She stood on the balcony of the secure penthouse, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city looking washed and new. She had packed her bags. The $10,000 a week, plus a massive bonus, was sitting in a secure account. Her apartment was waiting. Her life was waiting. She heard the heavy, familiar footsteps behind her. Gabriel stepped onto the balcony. He was wearing a simple black Henley and slacks, looking less like a Mafia boss and more like the father she had seen building Lego castles. "Silas has the car ready," Gabriel said quietly. His voice was tight, carefully controlled. "He will take you wherever you want to go. The hospital has your old position, waiting, with a promotion. You are safe, Jessica. Nobody will ever touch you." Jessica gripped the railing. "Is that what you want, Gabriel? For me to leave?" Gabriel stepped closer, standing right behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "What I want," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "is to lock the doors, throw away the key, and never let you out of my sight. What I want is to give you the world. But I know what my world is, Jessica. It's blood, paranoia, and violence. You are a healer. You save lives. I take them. It is profoundly selfish of me to ask you to stay in the dark with a monster." Jessica turned around, looking up into his dark, haunted eyes. "I didn't fall in love with a monster," Jessica said fiercely. "I fell in love with a father who tore a city apart to save his son. I fell in love with a man who let me stitch his wounds and didn't flinch. I fell in love with Gabriel." Gabriel's breath caught. He stared at her. The walls he had built around his heart for 4 years, finally shattering completely. "Besides," Jessica added, a small, tearful smile playing on her lips, "who's going to make sure Leo eats his vegetables? Silas?" From the sliding glass door behind them, a small voice echoed in the quiet night air. "Jessica stays." Jessica and Gabriel turned. Leo was standing in the doorway, holding his favorite stuffed bear. He looked up at them, his dark eyes clear and bright. He walked out onto the balcony, grabbed Jessica's hand, and then reached out to grab Gabriel's. He pulled their hands together, intertwining their fingers. Gabriel dropped to his knees, pulling both Jessica and Leo into his arms. The ruthless boss of Chicago buried his face in Jessica's neck, and for the first time in his life, he let himself cry. Not out of grief, but out of profound, overwhelming gratitude. 3 years later, the rain drummed gently against the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly rebuilt Rossi estate in Lake Forest. It was a brighter, warmer house now, filled with sunlight, art, and the chaotic sounds of childhood. Jessica walked down the grand staircase, smoothing the skirt of her elegant emerald green dress. She wasn't wearing scrubs anymore. She wore the quiet, undeniable authority of the matriarch of the most powerful family in the Midwest. She entered the massive dining room. At the head of the table sat Gabriel, reviewing a stack of legitimate business contracts. Since the fall of the Morettis, Gabriel had systematically laundered his empire, moving the Rossi family out of the shadows and into legitimate real estate and shipping. He was still feared, but he was no longer hunted. Next to him sat Leo, now 9 years old, animatedly telling his father about a science project. Leo never stopped talking now. "Dinner is almost ready," Jessica announced, walking over and placing a kiss on top of Leo's head. Gabriel looked up, his eyes instantly softening the moment they landed on her. He reached out, pulling her by the waist until she was sitting on his lap. He pressed a kiss to her jawline, his hand resting intimately over the slight, new swell of her stomach. "How is she today?" Gabriel murmured against her skin. "Kicking like her father." Jessica laughed softly, resting her hand over his. Gabriel smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile. He looked at his son, laughing at the table, and then at the woman who had walked into an alleyway and changed the entire trajectory of their lives. No good deed goes unpunished, the cynics say. But as Jessica leaned her head against Gabriel's shoulder, listening to the rain fall outside, she knew the cynics were wrong. Sometimes a good deed doesn't punish you. Sometimes it just leads you home. And there it is, from a terrifying encounter in a rainy alleyway to becoming the powerful, fiercely protective matriarch of the Rossi Empire. Jessica's journey is the ultimate testament to the fact that love can conquer even the darkest of underworlds. What was your absolute favorite twist in this story? Did you expect Jessica to take down Carmine's guard herself? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you loved this intense, action-packed Mafia romance drama and want me to write more epic, multi-part sagas just like this one, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. See you in the next one.